Thank you to John for the introduction, and thank you very much to Joe as well for the invitation to come and talk to you today. So, as Joe mentioned, John mentioned, so my name is John Devaney, and I'm a lecturer and a forest ecologist at Maynooth University. And I've been lucky enough over the last number of years to work on a couple of different projects which have sought to investigate mapping our ancient woodlands in a little bit more detail than what's been done previously. So what I'm going to discuss this afternoon is a summary of a scoping study that was funded by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. It was kind of a desk-based study to look at the condition of our ancient woodlands and to start to think about how we might go about completing an all-island inventory of our ancient woodlands. And then I'll kind of, towards the end of my talk, I'll tee up a new project which is co-funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine and the National Parks and Wildlife Service as well. Essentially, so I'm going to mention what are ancient woodlands and why are they important. I think most people in the room will have some understanding of that already. Mention where are our ancient woodlands and what condition they're in. And then I'm going to circle back to talk about where exactly our ancient woodlands are, because as you'll see, we have some idea, but we don't have a perfect picture of that. And then, as I said, I'm going to talk about what comes next and some other research that is just kicking off now that will look at this in a lot more detail. So, as I mentioned, there's a desk-based scoping study that is completed a few months ago called the LEAF project. So, LEAF standing for Long Established and Ancient Forests. And this was funded by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So, there's a bunch of us who are together with Dr. Jenny Roach at the MPWS. So myself and Dr. Helen Shaw, who's a paleoecologist, who's here as well. Fraser Mitchell, who many of you will know is also a paleoecologist from Trinity College Dublin. Dr. Eamon Darcy, who's a historian. Thomas, who's a PhD student working in our group, and a number of others as well. And I said the focus really, we didn't manage to get out, or the scope of the project wasn't to go out and survey sites, but we were looking at the available evidence that we have on the condition and the extent of our ancient woodlands. So the aim of that project was to evaluate the conservation status of ancient woodlands using what information we had, to use historic OS maps and first edition OS maps to digitize woodland cover in the 1830s in a couple of case study counties, which I'll come back to in a second, and then also to review what paleoecological evidence we have. And I won't talk about that, I'll leave that to Helen to discuss. So what is an ancient woodland? So in the Republic, we use this definition of woodland that is believed to have been continuously wooded since 1660, and that's the same for Northern Ireland as well. And that really goes back to something that John mentioned, and that's the availability of maps from the Down Survey. So this image here in the middle is a depiction of a Down Survey parish map from County Leitrim. So this was a survey that was conducted in the 1650s. We don't have full coverage, so some of the maps haven't survived to the present day, but in a lot of counties, we do have county level maps, barony level maps, and also parish maps that contain really, really valuable information on the type of land cover. And often they come with what we call terriers, which are written descriptions of the land use at that time. You'll see in different jurisdictions in England and Scotland, for example, they have a kind of a slightly different definition for what ancient woodland is, and that goes back to what map evidence is available. So for example, in Scotland, I think they use Roy maps, which are slightly later. So to some extent, our definition of 1650s, it is a bit arbitrary. It just links back to what map evidence we have. We also talk about long established woodland, and this is woodland or areas that have been continuously wooded since at least the 1830s when those first edition OS maps were produced. So it's important to kind of make the point that when we talk about ancient woodlands, we're really only focusing on how long they have been wooded, okay? And in many cases, these are native woodlands and management is not so intense, but it would include woodlands that maybe have transitioned to mixed planted woodlands, and even in some cases, woodlands that have transitioned to conifer woodlands, okay? So even though, let's say, a planted ancient woodland site that is now dominated by conifers may not have the same biodiversity value as a semi-natural ancient woodland, but it still does retain some features of ancientness, which we think are important to document and to know where those sites are, so maybe we can restore and protect them to some extent. Why are ancient woodlands important? I won't dwell on this. I think everyone understands this in this room. So obviously, exceptional biodiversity value, and our more pristine ancient woodlands tend to have a greater biodiversity value than highly managed, more recent planted woodlands. But it's not just a biodiversity value. Ancient woodlands that have low levels of disturbance tend to be very good at storing carbon. So above ground in large veteran trees, for example, but also below ground in soil carbon, where there's been minimal disturbance. Often you get lots of carbon stored in the soil. Recreation value, amenity value, we saw that this morning in the Crum Estate, where it was beautiful just to be there to walk around and spend time in the woodlands like that. And also we're learning more and more about the science behind the health benefits of being in these natural spaces. So there's kind of a mental health value to protecting these type of habitats as well. But something that's arguably most difficult to quantify, but possibly the most important aspect of these type of sites is their cultural and historical importance. So we know that we are, or we were once a very, very heavily wooded island, and we've lost so much of that woodland that whatever fragments we do have left are exceptionally important to protect and to understand where they are. So irreplaceable, valuable habitats. So this is, I'm going to talk briefly about what we know about our ancient woodlands in the Republic of Ireland. And we have a fantastic amount of information coming from this document here, which is the Provisional Inventory of Ancient and Long Established Woodlands. Many of you will be familiar with this. So this was done National Parks and Wildlife Service in conjunction with Beck Consultants. And this was published in 2010. And this kind of followed on from the National Survey of Native Woodlands. And it's a fantastic resource. This map shows the distribution of our ancient and long established sites. And really all the work that we've done follows on from this provisional inventory. So I do have to acknowledge the work that was done as part of that. And really a lot of our work is following similar methodologies. But there was a couple of limitations just in the scope of that work, and that was that it primarily focused on large woodlands. So really the mapping was primarily done on ancient and long established woodlands that were 5 hectares in size, or over 5 hectares in size. That was the threshold. And also because the basis of that study was the National Inventory of Native Woodlands, there was a lot of sites that are now actually dominated by conifers that would have been left out of that study. So fantastic resource, but we know that there are a lot more ancient and long established woodlands out there that we haven't captured in this inventory. So what the scoping study that I was involved in was doing was trying to see how can we go about figuring out where those areas are and including them in our inventory so we can manage them more efficiently in the future. So it's a bit blurry on the screen here, but an example of places that maybe are missed from that inventory are this site exactly where we are today. So you can see up here, this is the Scout Centre where we are. So you can see most of the woodland around here is planted conifer. There's some mixed woodland as well. But if we look in the first edition map from the 1830s, you can see where we are today is on the site of an old orchard. It's actually an interesting feature of these old maps. There was a lot more orchards back in the 1830s than there are now. So the symbology in the center there is indicating the presence of an orchard on the first edition map. You can see Castle Saunderson is mapped there. But a lot of the area around here was woodland in the 1830s. So it is long established woodland, but it's not in the inventory of ancient and long established woodland, probably because it's now dominated by planted conifers. So it wasn't covered in that initial provisional survey. So it kind of highlights the need for our expanded inventory. So I'll come back to the extent of our ancient woodlands in a second, but I just want to mention what is the current conservation status of the ancient and long established woodlands in the Republic of Ireland. Now, what we're lacking is a systematic survey of ancient and long established woodlands. We don't have information for a lot of the sites. What we do have is a network of woodland monitoring sites that come from Habitats Directive monitoring surveys. So if you take the sites where fieldwork has been conducted and a lot of information, ecological variables, including understory vegetation, different threats, different negative factors that are impacting the ecological condition of these sites, we have about 75 locations that overlap with our known ancient and long established woodlands, and that's what's mapped here. So the different colours are just indicating different woodland types that are different woodland classifications from the Habitats Directive. So oak woodlands here in red, and we have alluvial woodlands in green, and so on. So we have really detailed information for about 75 ancient and long established woodlands that we can consider their ecological condition. And unfortunately, it doesn't give us a good picture, and it kind of reflects the overall ecological condition of a lot of our woodland sites. So on the left here is looking at the overall conservation status of AW and PAW. So this is ancient woodlands and possible ancient woodlands. And there's just a slight difference in the classification there, because ancient woodlands are sites where we have really strong evidence that they are ancient. And then possible ancient woodlands is where evidence suggests they're possible or that they're ancient, but we're not 100% sure. So from those ancient woodlands and possible ancient woodland sites, there's only 23% of those that have a favourable conservation status. All the rest have either an unfavourable inadequate or an unfavourable bad conservation status. And then for the LEWs, the long established woodland, it tells a very similar story. Only 32% of those sites are listed as having a favourable conservation status. So what is the reason for that? Well, it's a similar story in many sites. By far and away, the most common negative impacts in our ancient and long established woodlands come from overgrazing and invasive species. Okay, two issues that even driving in, I could see that they have here too. The cherry laurel here, we saw a deer roaming outside when we were having our lunch. And these two issues are pervasive across the landscape in the Republic of Ireland. So I think these two pictures kind of nicely illustrate a kind of a site that has unfavourable status versus one that has a favourable status. So on the left here, we're looking at Derryconnachie Wood, which is a woodland in Clarny National Park. And you can see there's a kind of a missing understory here. We don't see very much in terms of the ground flora or certainly in the shrub layer. And this is largely due to the negative impacts of overgrazing by deer. And also, many of you will be familiar with the severe impact of invasive species in Clarny National Park, primarily rhododendron. Whereas on the right here, we have a picture from Glengariff Wood, which is in West Cork. And this was one of the sites, or one of our ancient woodland sites, that had a favourable conservation status. So you can see here a much more developed understory and shrub layer. And what's interesting about Glengariff is that it does have similar issues, in that there are issues with invasive species, again with rhododendron, but there has been consistent management and eradication of rhododendron at the site, and that has led to a favourable conservation status. So with intervention, we can improve the status of these ancient woodlands. Possibly even more worrying was something that we looked at, was the deforestation of our ancient woodland sites. So I think the story of woodland cover on this island has been death by 1,000 cuts. So over millennia, gradually losing our forest cover through deforestation. And what's kind of shocking is that despite the fact we have so little ancient and long established woodland, we're still seeing examples of deforestation happening today. So what this map is showing is sites where we see some level of deforestation. So when I say deforestation, I mean the permanent transition from forest land use to non-forest land use. So it doesn't just mean felling of trees, because if replanting follows, the land use wouldn't change. It means the changing of the land use from forest to something else. And this one is just looking at recent deforestation of our ancient and long established woodland sites. So it's comparing aerial photographs from 2000 with more recent ones from 2017. And we actually documented 93 incidences of deforestation. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire site was felled and changed to different land use, but it means some part of the site there was examples of deforestation. So what this graph is showing is the post-deforestation land use transition. So that means, what are these woodlands moving into? And by far and away, the number one post-deforestation land use transition was to built land rural. So these different categories come from the National Forest Inventory, which is conducted by the Forest Service. So examples of that could be one-off housing development. We also have a lot of conversion of our ancient and long-established woodland to agricultural grassland. Green space rural could be golf courses, for example, playing pitches, and various other land use transitions. So even despite the fact that these are really important special habitats, we still have so many negative impacts like overgrazing and invasive species and even deforestation. Here are just a couple of quick examples. All along the left panel are aerial photographs from 2000, and on the right hand side are aerial photographs from 2017. So all of these would be ancient and long established woodlands. Up at the top we have a broadleaf woodland, and you can see 17 years later this woodland has now been converted to a housing development. In the middle here, this is a scrub woodland in 2000. 17 years later, that's now agricultural grassland. And here, this is an ancient woodland site, even though it is planted dominant by conifers. But 17 years later, it's now a fairway of a golf course. So deforestation continues. So why is this happening? And to some extent, it's possibly related to the fact that we have no formal protection. There's no formal designation of ancient woodland sites. Okay, so much of the conservation of sites in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, certainly in the Republic of Ireland, is related to the Habitats Directive, SACs. But you'll see here on this graph, on the right-hand side, only about less than half of the ancient and long-established woodlands occur within a special area of conservation. The vast majority of sites are not designated in any way at all. So this map is just showing all of the ancient and long-established woodlands documented by the provisional inventory. Ones in green occur within protected areas, and the ones in red fall outside our protected areas. Okay, so lots of them are not protected. So just to go back again to that idea of where exactly are our ancient woodlands. So as I said, we have great information from the provisional inventory, but some smaller sites are likely missing. So we did a case study of mapping all long-established woodland, all woodland that occurs on those first edition maps. Anything bigger than 0.1 of a hectare, so even really tiny fragments of woodland, we wanted to capture them. And we did this in two case study counties, in County Leitrim and County Kilkenny, and I'm only just going to present some very brief summary results of County Kilkenny. How do we go about doing this? So to do it in a systematic way, the first thing we do is we put what we call a fishnet grid on top of these old maps. So this image here is our first edition map, and the grid you see on top of it is 1 by 1 kilometer squares, which we can then work through and manually digitize any woodland polygons that we see. And once our 1 by 1 square is complete, we mark that, we change the color of it, so we know that it's complete. And that way we can kind of systematically go through every single square in the county. So this is just an example of what we end up with, digitized polygons of woodland. And as I mentioned this morning, there are different types of woodland symbology in those maps. So we can say whether it's broadleaf woodland or mixed woodland or conifer woodland. And then this is just an example of our GIS database that we had. So this is all done through ArcGIS. Many of you will be familiar with that. So here's just a few quick examples of the type of woodlands that we're looking at. So lots of relatively large sites that are still more or less intact. This is a large broadleaf woodland in County Kilkenny. This is it in the 1830s, and over on the right there, for the most part, it's still intact. But what's really fantastic about these woodlands is that even tiny fragments were mapped back in the 1830s, and in many cases we see that they're still there today. This is a tiny little site, 0.25 hectares in size, and it's still there today. so we can include them. Even these small little areas are now included in those maps. However, we see a lot of places that are no longer there. So this is a large 8-hectare woodland in Ballyraggart in County Kilkenny, and you can see now it's been converted to an industrial site. And probably most common is these small pockets of broadleaf woodland that are now agricultural grassland. So what's nice about what we're doing is that we're digitizing not only the stuff that's there today, but also what was there in 1830. So we have a record of how much we've lost since that point. We might talk about that later in terms of how that can inform what we do next in terms of maybe trying to restore or kind of conserve some areas. So that's our long established woodlands from the 1830s. Next question is, what do we do next? How do we determine whether they're actually ancient, if they've been around since the 1600s? And there's a whole suite of archival information that we use as a first step towards making that determination. And these are just some of them here. I'm not going to go through this in detail because Annalie is our historian and she knows a lot more about that than I do, so I'll leave that to her. So very briefly now, because I know I'm using up all the time, here's a summary of some information that we have from Kilkenny. So this is our map of woodland cover in the 1830s in Kilkenny. So this is every single woodland polygon digitized, all the way down to 0.1 of a hectare. In total, there was over 5,000 polygons that were manually digitized from the first edition maps. The total area at the time was nearly 8,000 hectares of woodland. So that was a forest cover of almost 4% of Kilkenny back then. And this is the first time that we're starting to see this information, that we can actually quantify what was the forest cover in Ireland at that time. Of that 8,000 hectares, there's about 3.5 remains today. Okay, so 3,500 hectares of woodland that was there in the 1830s is still there today. But just for context, current forest cover in Kilkenny is 10%, whereas our long-established woodland is 1.7%. So the vast majority of woodland that is there is recently established conifer plantations. So this is just comparing what was there in the 1830s and what is left now of that ancient and long-established woodland. So you can see that a lot of the bigger polygons, a lot of those bigger parcels of long-established woodlands have remained, but a hell of a lot of the small little pockets, those tiny little fragments, a lot of them have been removed at this stage. They've been deforested. In terms of the ancient woodlands, so when we did go back and look at the archival information, we documented 39 ancient and 34 possible ancient sites in County Kilkenny. And the vast majority of these sites were classified as ancient or possible ancient because there's excellent coverage of down survey maps for Kilkenny. So lots of really detailed parish maps for Kilkenny that we could say that, yes, we think these woodlands were there in the 1600s. So in terms of the area of ancient woodlands in Kilkenny, it was around 850 hectares. And then we can, of those sites that are left today, 268 hectares are broadleaf woodland, 326 are mixed, and of the ancient woodlands, 263 hectares have now been converted to conifer woodland. So to talk about what comes next. So that was all part of the scoping study. So we did this case study in 2 counties. And thankfully, this has led on to a much bigger project called Ancient Woodlands Ireland. And the objective of this project is to deliver a full, complete inventory of ancient woodlands in Ireland. And what's great about this project is that it's an all-island project. So this includes Northern Ireland as well as the Republic. We worked as researchers in Maynooth University, in Teagasc, in Dundalk IT, and we also work with the Woodland Trust in Northern Ireland to try and deliver this ancient woodlands inventory that includes all sites, even those smaller areas that were missed in the provisional inventory. Very much a multidisciplinary project, so Jessica will talk about the kind of spatial analysis side of things, and Annalie, a historian, and Helen, who's a paleoecologist. And hopefully this will provide the evidence base that can inform policy as to how we manage these woodlands going into the future. I won't go through this in any detail because the other speakers are going to talk about this, but this is kind of the process that we use for how we determine or how we produce our ancient woodland inventory. So as I said, we start off with the maps. Then we look at the archival information, delving back a bit further in time. Then we look at the paleoecological evidence that's out there. And we also use indicator species as well. And one thing to say is I talked about the number of polygons that we digitized. All that was done manually by hand on a computer screen, which is really, really challenging to do when you're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of polygons. It's very labor intensive. But there are new ways of doing this that might save us a lot of time and make this a feasible project to complete in the coming years. If you're interested, we have a new website. It just went live. So ancientwoodlandsireland.com, and you can see some information there about the project. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can find email contacts on that. So yeah, just to very briefly acknowledge our funders. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service, Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, to Philip Heron and Orla Daly and Beck Consultants for their work on the provisional inventory, and to the Woodland Trust and their work on Back on the Map project. Lots of people who've helped out and given us guidance. And just to also mention David Smith and the Native Woodland Trust, and a team of citizen scientists who during COVID were working on a project where they were looking at these first edition maps and identifying and listing these ancient and long established woodlands in lots of different counties around Ireland, and our work to some extent is following on from what they started as well. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.